In 1983, a 10-year-old boy named Kelly King disappeared from his family's Chicago mansion. He was the only child of parents worth over $400 million, heir to a fortune built over 3 generations. For 25 years, his case remained one of Illinois' most baffling mysteries. Then, in 2008, he was discovered living in a homeless shelter on the city's south side. But this wasn't a kidnapping. So what happened to Kelly King? Why did he vanish? And how did a child worth hundreds of millions end up with nothing? Kelly King was born on March 15, 1973, into a level of wealth most people can barely imagine. His father, Richard King, had inherited a successful manufacturing company from his own father and had grown it into an empire worth roughly $400 million by the early 1980s. The company produced industrial equipment and had contracts with major corporations across the United States. Kelly's mother, Patricia King, came from old Chicago money herself. Her family owned significant real estate throughout the city. Together, Richard and Patricia represented the kind of established wealth that defined Chicago's elite social circles. They lived in a massive estate in the suburb of Lake Forest, about 30 miles north of downtown Chicago. The house sat on 5 acres of perfectly manicured grounds, with a main residence that contained 14 rooms, a swimming pool, tennis courts, and a separate guest house. Kelly was their only child, and from the moment he was born, he was destined to inherit everything. Growing up as the sole heir to such enormous wealth came with pressures that most children never experience. Kelly attended an exclusive private school where tuition cost more than most families earned in a year. He had private tutors for subjects where he struggled, music lessons from accomplished teachers, and every material advantage money could buy. But those who knew the family well noticed that Kelly often seemed lonely. Being an only child in that massive house meant spending a lot of time alone, even when his parents were home. Richard King worked long hours running his company, often traveling for business. Patricia was involved in numerous charitable organizations and social committees, maintaining the family's position in Chicago society. They loved their son, certainly, but their lives were consumed by obligations that left limited time for the quiet, everyday moments that build close relationships. Kelly's nanny, a woman named Ruth Morrison, probably spent more waking hours with him than his own parents did. Ruth would later tell investigators that Kelly was a sweet, thoughtful child who seemed much older than his years, as if the weight of expectations had aged him prematurely. The events that would change Kelly King's life forever began on a cold Saturday in November of 1983. Kelly was 10 years old, in 5th grade at his private school. That morning started like most weekends in the King household. Richard had left early for the office. Even though it was Saturday, he often worked weekends when major deals were pending. Patricia was preparing for a charity luncheon she was hosting the following week. Kelly had breakfast with Ruth in the kitchen, then went upstairs to his room to work on a school project. Around 11 o'clock in the morning, Patricia checked on Kelly and found him reading at his desk. She told him she needed to run some errands and would be back in a few hours. She reminded him that Ruth was downstairs if he needed anything. Kelly said he understood and went back to his reading. This brief conversation would be the last time Patricia King saw her son for 25 years. The casual nature of that goodbye would haunt her for the rest of her life. Ruth Morrison was in the laundry room folding clothes around noon when she heard the front door close. She assumed it was Patricia returning from her errands, though it seemed early. When Ruth went to check, she found the front door closed but no one in the house. She called out for Kelly but received no answer. She searched his room and found it empty. His coat was gone from the closet. Ruth felt the first stirrings of concern but tried to stay calm. Perhaps Kelly had gone outside to play in the yard. She checked the grounds but found no sign of him. She called the guest house where the groundskeeper lived, but he hadn't seen Kelly either. By 12:30, Ruth's concern had grown into genuine worry. She called Patricia's car phone, a luxury item in 1983, but got no answer. She called Richard's office and finally reached him around 1 o'clock. He told her to call the police immediately while he rushed home. When Patricia returned at 1:30 and learned that Kelly was missing, she became nearly hysterical. Within 2 hours of Ruth noticing Kelly's absence, the Lake Forest Police Department had launched a full-scale search operation. The initial investigation moved with the urgency that missing child cases demand. Lake Forest Police brought in dogs to track Kelly's scent. The dogs followed a trail from the King house down the long driveway to the road, where the scent disappeared. This suggested that Kelly had left on foot, but then gotten into a vehicle. The question was whether he had gotten into that vehicle willingly or been forced. Investigators questioned Ruth Morrison extensively. She insisted that Kelly had seemed perfectly normal that morning, showing no signs of distress or unusual behavior. She mentioned that he had been quieter than usual lately, but attributed that to the pressures of school and his parents' busy schedules. Police questioned the King family's employees, the groundskeeper, the housekeeper who came 3 times a week, the pool maintenance worker. All had alibis and none had noticed anything suspicious. Detectives interviewed Kelly's classmates and teachers. They described Kelly as a good student, well-behaved and polite, though somewhat reserved and not particularly close with other children. No one reported any conflicts, bullying, or concerning behavior. The investigation expanded to examine whether this could be a kidnapping for ransom, given the family's wealth. But as days passed without any ransom demand, that theory began to seem less likely. 1 week after Kelly's disappearance, the case took on a life of its own in the media. The story had everything that captured public attention. A wealthy family, a missing child, mysterious circumstances. Television news covered the story extensively. Newspapers ran Kelly's school photo on their front pages. Richard and Patricia King made tearful public appeals for their son's return, promising that they wouldn't press charges against anyone who brought him home safely. They offered a reward of $250,000 for information leading to Kelly's safe return. Tips poured in from across the country. Each one had to be investigated. Police followed up on reported sightings in neighboring states, investigated claims from people who swore they had seen Kelly in shopping malls or restaurants, chased down leads that almost always turned out to be cases of mistaken identity. The investigation consumed enormous resources, but after 3 weeks of intensive searching, detectives had made almost no real progress. Kelly King had seemingly vanished into thin air. As weeks turned into months without resolution, the case gradually faded from the news. Though it never closed officially, the Kings hired private investigators who worked the case for years, but they found nothing either. What no one knew at the time was that Kelly King had not been kidnapped. He had run away. The decision had been building in his mind for months before that November morning. Kelly had been feeling increasingly overwhelmed by the expectations placed on him, the loneliness of his isolated life, and a growing sense that he was living in a beautiful prison. He loved his parents, but he barely knew them. They were always busy, always somewhere else, always preparing for the next business deal or social obligation. Kelly had overheard conversations between his parents about his future, which prep school he would attend, then which Ivy League university, then joining his father's company. His entire life seemed mapped out before he had any say in it. A few weeks before his disappearance, Kelly had befriended an older boy who did yard work in the neighborhood. This boy, whose name was Marcus Webb, was 16 and lived in a working-class neighborhood closer to the city. Marcus had told Kelly stories about his life, riding the bus alone, working to help his family, having freedoms that Kelly couldn't imagine despite all his wealth. Those conversations had planted an idea in Kelly's mind that wouldn't go away. What if he could just leave? What if he could choose a different life? On that Saturday morning in November, Kelly had made his decision. He had been planning it for days with the careful attention to detail that his expensive education had taught him. He had taken $300 in cash from his mother's purse over several weeks, a little at a time so she wouldn't notice. He had packed a small backpack with clothes and hidden it in the garden shed 2 days earlier. When his mother left for her errands and Ruth was busy with laundry, Kelly had retrieved the backpack, put on his coat, and walked out the front door. His heart pounded as he made his way down the long driveway, certain that at any moment someone would call out to him, stop him, bring him back. But no one did. He walked along the tree-lined street until he reached a bus stop about half a mile from his house. He had looked up the route days earlier in the phone book. The bus would take him into Chicago. He waited for 20 minutes, terrified that someone would recognize him, but the few people at the stop paid him no attention. When the bus finally arrived, he climbed aboard, paid his fare, and took a seat near the back. As the bus pulled away, Kelly King watched his old life disappear behind him. He was 10 years old and completely alone, heading into a city he barely knew with no plan beyond escape. Kelly's first night away from home was spent in a downtown Chicago bus station. He had gotten off the bus when it reached the city centre, overwhelmed by the noise and crowds of people. He wandered the streets for hours, amazed by how different this was from Lake Forest. Here, no one knew who he was. No one cared that he was the king heir. He was just another kid. When darkness fell and the November cold became harder to ignore, Kelly found his way to the Greyhound station. He sat in the waiting area among other travellers, trying to look like he belonged there, like someone was coming to pick him up. When station attendants asked if he was all right, he said his aunt was meeting him soon. They seemed to accept this. Kelly dozed in his seat through the night, waking every time someone walked past, alert to danger he didn't fully understand. By morning he was exhausted, hungry, and beginning to realize how unprepared he was for life on his own. But he was also determined not to go back. Whatever hardships lay ahead, he told himself, they had to be better than the suffocating loneliness of that big house. Over the following weeks, Kelly learned to survive on Chicago's streets. He quickly realized that his $300 wouldn't last long. He slept in bus stations and train stations until security started recognizing him and chasing him out. He discovered that churches and homeless shelters would give him meals if he showed up at the right times. He learned which areas of the city were safer and which to avoid. He learned to make himself invisible, to keep his head down, to never make eye contact with adults who might ask questions. The hardest part was the constant fear of being recognized. He had seen his own face on television screens in store windows, on newspaper stands, in the bus station. But as weeks passed and no one seemed to connect the dirty, disheveled boy they saw on the street with the well-groomed child in those photos, his fear gradually eased. Winter in Chicago was brutal. Kelly had never experienced real cold before. His previous life had moved between heated houses and heated cars. Now he understood what cold could do to a person. He spent his days in public libraries where it was warm and he could read. At night, he sought out steam grates or the warmest corners of subway stations. He got sick several times and suffered through fevers alone, wrapped in newspapers and cardboard. By the time spring arrived in 1984, Kelly had been on the streets for 6 months. He had turned 11 years old in March, though he hadn't told anyone and no one had celebrated with him. He had lost weight and grown taller, his face thinner and older looking. His clothes were dirty and torn. He no longer looked anything like the boy in those missing person posters, though those posters were becoming less common anyway as the case faded from public attention. Kelly had found a community of sorts among other homeless youth. There were more kids living on the streets than he had ever imagined, most of them runaways like himself, though some had been kicked out of their homes or had aged out of foster care. He met a girl named Amy Chen who was 13 and had been homeless for over a year. Amy taught Kelly more about survival, where to find food banks, which shelter workers were kind, how to avoid the predators who targeted vulnerable kids. She became the closest thing to a friend Kelly had in his new life. But Amy also struggled with demons Kelly was only beginning to understand. She used drugs to escape the pain of her situation, and she urged Kelly to try them too. Kelly resisted at first, but the constant stress and loneliness wore him down. Back in Lake Forest, Richard and Patricia King were destroying themselves with guilt and grief. Their marriage, which had always been more of a partnership than a passionate romance, began to crumble under the weight of Kelly's absence. Patricia blamed Richard for working too much, for not being present in Kelly's life. Richard blamed Patricia for being too focused on social obligations, for treating their son like an accessory to their lifestyle rather than a person with feelings and needs. Both blamed themselves for not seeing the signs, for not realizing how unhappy their son must have been. The truth was that they had loved Kelly deeply, but they had loved him in the only way they knew how, by providing material comfort and security, by planning his future, by doing what they thought parents in their position were supposed to do. They had never stopped to ask Kelly what he wanted or needed. They had never considered that all their wealth and all their efforts might be making him miserable. As the first anniversary of Kelly's disappearance approached, the private investigators the Kings had hired gently suggested that it might be time to accept that Kelly was likely dead. Children who disappeared without a trace rarely came back. Richard refused to accept this. He kept the investigation going, kept paying investigators to chase down leads, kept hoping for a miracle that never came. Kelly's teenage years passed in a blur of survival and slow decline. He moved between homeless shelters, abandoned buildings, and occasional short-term stays in group homes when social services managed to get him off the streets temporarily. He never stayed long in any place where he had to provide identification or background information. He used different names, sometimes calling himself Kevin, sometimes Chris, once even using the name Marcus in honor of the boy whose stories had inspired his escape. He worked odd jobs when he could, washing dishes at restaurants that paid cash, doing day labor at construction sites, collecting bottles and cans for their deposit value. The money he earned went mostly to survival, but sometimes to the drugs that Amy had introduced him to. By the time Kelly was 15, he was using regularly. The drugs helped numb the constant anxiety, the loneliness, the growing realization that he had made a terrible mistake, but couldn't figure out how to fix it. How could he go home after all this time? What would he say? The longer he stayed away, the harder it became to imagine returning. By his 16th birthday, Kelly couldn't remember why running away had seemed like a good idea. But by then, he was so deep into street life, so changed from the boy he had been, that going home felt impossible. When Kelly turned 18 in March of 1991, something shifted in his mind. He realized that he was now legally an adult. He could start over if he wanted to. He could create a new life without running from his old one. Because he was no longer a missing child, he was a man. Kelly decided to get clean. He checked himself into a free drug treatment program run by a non-profit organization on the city's west side. The program was grueling. Withdrawal was physically painful and emotionally devastating. But Kelly stuck with it, driven by a desperate need to reclaim some sense of control over his life. He spent 3 months in the residential program, then moved to a halfway house where he could stay while he looked for work and tried to build a stable life. For a brief period, it seemed like Kelly might succeed. He found a job washing cars at a dealership. He started attending support group meetings. He began to imagine a future that didn't involve sleeping in shelters or searching for his next meal. But the weight of his past was always there, pressing down on him. He would see families together and feel a piercing sense of loss for the parents he had abandoned. He would pass men in expensive suits and remember his father. The guilt became unbearable. Kelly relapsed after 6 months of sobriety. The relapse was devastating because he had begun to believe he could escape his old patterns. Once he started using again, he quickly fell back into the cycle of homelessness and desperation. He lost his job. He was kicked out of the halfway house for violating their rules. He found himself back on the streets, older now but no wiser, carrying more trauma and more guilt than before. The 90s passed this way. Periods of effort and hope followed by collapse and despair. Kelly would get clean, find work, rent a room somewhere. Then something would trigger his anxiety and guilt. He would use again, and the fragile structure of his life would fall apart. Each cycle left him worse off than before. By the time he reached his mid-20s, Kelly looked much older than his actual age. Years of drug use, poor nutrition, and exposure to the elements had ravaged his body. His teeth were damaged from lack of dental care. His skin showed the premature aging that comes from constant stress and outdoor living. Anyone who had known him as a child would have struggled to recognize the man he had become. And that, in a way, was exactly what Kelly had wanted, to become someone else entirely, to shed the identity of Kelly King. He had succeeded, but the cost had been everything. In 2003, 20 years after his disappearance, Kelly experienced a moment of clarity that came close to changing everything. He was staying at a shelter on the south side of Chicago, and a volunteer there noticed that Kelly seemed more educated and articulate than many of the other residents. This volunteer, a retired teacher named Janet Wilson, began talking with Kelly regularly. She sensed that there was more to his story than he was telling. Over several months, Janet gently encouraged Kelly to open up about his past. She didn't push, but she made it clear that she cared about him and wanted to help. One evening, Kelly came very close to telling Janet the truth. They were sitting in the shelter's common area after dinner, and Janet had been talking about how everyone deserves a second chance, how it's never too late to reconnect with family. Kelly felt the words forming in his mouth. My real name is Kelly King. I disappeared when I was 10 years old. My parents have been looking for me for 20 years, but he couldn't say it. The shame was too overwhelming. How could he explain to this kind woman that he had thrown away a life of privilege and put his parents through 2 decades of agony? How could he face his parents after all this time? He stayed silent, and the moment passed. Janet continued volunteering at the shelter for another year. then moved to Arizona to be near her grandchildren. Kelly never told her his secret. The breakthrough in Kelly's case came from an unexpected source in 2008. A young social worker named Marcus Cole, no relation to the Marcus Webb who had known Kelly as a child, started working at the Southside Hope Shelter, where Kelly had been staying on and off for several years. Marcus was in his late 20s, idealistic and determined to make a real difference in the lives of homeless individuals. He had recently completed his master's degree in social work and was full of energy and ideas about how to help people rebuild their lives. Marcus noticed Kelly because Kelly was different from many of the shelter's residents. Despite years of homelessness and substance abuse, Kelly still spoke with an educated vocabulary and showed flashes of the intelligence that had been cultivated in his expensive childhood education. Marcus tried to engage Kelly in conversation, asking about his background and whether he had family he could reconnect with. Kelly, as always, deflected the questions and gave vague answers about coming from North and losing touch with his family years ago. But Marcus was persistent in a gentle way. He kept trying to connect with Kelly, kept looking for an opening that might allow him to really help. What Marcus didn't know was that his persistence was slowly breaking down the walls Kelly had built around his past. In September of 2008, Marcus Cole was doing some research for a grant proposal he was writing. The grant would fund programs to help homeless individuals reconnect with estranged family members. As part of his research, Marcus was reading through old case files of long-term missing persons, trying to understand the scope of family separation in America. That's when he came across a Chicago Tribune article from 1983 about a missing 10-year-old boy named Kelly King. The article included a photo of Kelly taken shortly before his disappearance, a well-groomed child in a school uniform, smiling at the camera with what looked like a forced expression. Marcus stared at that photo for a long time. Something about the bone structure of the face, the shape of the eyes, reminded him of someone. Then it hit him. The resemblance was faint and distorted by 25 years of hard living, but Marcus could see it. The man he knew as Kevin Matthews, who had been staying at the shelter for the past 3 years, looked like this missing boy. It seemed impossible. The Kelly King in this article was worth $400 million. Why would someone from that kind of wealth end up homeless? But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling. He started digging deeper, finding more articles about the case, more photos of Kelly from different angles and ages. The more he looked, the more convinced he became. Marcus Cole faced a dilemma. If he was right and Kevin Matthews was actually Kelly King, then this man had family who had been searching for him for 25 years. They deserved to know he was alive. But Marcus also knew that confronting Kelly about this could be traumatic and might drive him away. Kelly, or Kevin, as Marcus still thought of him, was fragile. He was maintaining sobriety with difficulty and had only recently started to trust the shelter staff. If Marcus approached this wrong, Kelly might disappear again, and Marcus would lose any chance to help him. Marcus decided to consult with his supervisor, a woman named Dr. Sharon Rodriguez, who had decades of experience in social work with homeless populations. Marcus showed her the articles and photos, explained his suspicions. Rodriguez was skeptical at first. The wealthy child in those photos seemed like a completely different person from the homeless man Marcus described, but she agreed that the resemblance was there. She advised Marcus to proceed very carefully. They needed to verify Kelly's identity before contacting his family, but they also needed to respect Kelly's autonomy and right to make his own choices. Together, they developed a plan. Marcus would gradually try to build more trust with Kelly, create opportunities for him to open up about his past. If Kelly revealed his true identity voluntarily, they could work with him to decide what to do next. It took Marcus 3 weeks of gentle, patient conversation before Kelly finally broke down and told him the truth. They were sitting in Marcus's small office at the shelter one afternoon in October. Marcus had been asking Kelly about whether he had ever thought about looking for his family, mentioning that the shelter had resources to help people reconnect with lost relatives. Kelly had been giving his usual vague answers, but Marcus could see the emotional strain on his face. Finally, Marcus took a chance. He pulled out a copy of that old newspaper article and placed it on the desk between them. "Kevin," Marcus said quietly, using the name Kelly had been going by, "I think you might be able to help me understand something. This article is about a missing boy from 1983. His name was Kelly King. I've been looking at this photo, and I keep thinking this boy looks familiar. Kelly stared at the article. His hands began to shake. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "That's me. My name is Kelly King. I ran away when I was 10 years old, and I've been running ever since." The admission, after 25 years of hiding, seemed to break something open in Kelly. He began to cry deep, wrenching sobs that came from decades of buried guilt and grief. Over the next several hours, Kelly told Marcus his story. He explained why he had run away as a child, the loneliness, the pressure, the feeling of being trapped in a life he hadn't chosen. He talked about his years on the streets, his struggles with addiction, his many failed attempts to build a normal life. He described the shame that had kept him from going home, how with each passing year it became harder to imagine facing his parents. He talked about the times he had seen news coverage of missing children, and thought about his own parents, wondering if they were still looking for him, if they blamed themselves, if they had given up hope. The guilt, Kelly said, had been like a weight pressing down on him every day of his life. He had run away to escape one kind of prison only to build another one inside his own mind. Marcus listened without judgment, occasionally asking gentle questions but mostly just letting Kelly talk. When Kelly finally fell silent, exhausted from the emotional release, Marcus asked him a crucial question. "What do you want to do now? Your parents might still be alive. They might still be looking for you. Do you want to try to contact them?" Kelly's answer came slowly. "I don't know if I can face them after what I've done. But I think I have to try." The process of verifying Kelly's identity and preparing to contact his family took several weeks. Dr. Rodriguez brought in a psychologist who specialized in trauma and family reunification. The psychologist, Dr. Benjamin Foster, met with Kelly multiple times to assess his mental state and prepare him for what might come next. Dr. Foster explained that reuniting with his family after 25 years would be emotionally complex. Kelly's parents, if they were still alive, would experience a mixture of joy, anger, grief, and confusion. Kelly himself would need to process his own complicated feelings about returning to a family he had abandoned. They couldn't rush this. Meanwhile, Marcus did some investigating to find out what had happened to Richard and Patricia King. What he learned was heartbreaking. Richard King had died in 2004 from a heart attack at age 68. He had never stopped searching for his son. In his will, he had left instructions that the search for Kelly should continue and had established a trust fund that would be available to Kelly if he was ever found. Patricia King was still alive, now 73 years old. She had remarried in 2006 to a man named Thomas Bradshaw, a retired attorney who had been a friend of the family. Patricia and Thomas lived in a condominium in downtown Chicago, a much smaller and simpler home than the Lake Forest estate where Kelly had grown up. When Marcus told Kelly that his father had died without ever knowing what happened to him, Kelly's grief was profound. He had carried guilt about his parents for 25 years, but he had always imagined that someday he might be able to explain, to apologize, to make things right. Now he had lost half that chance forever. His father had died still wondering where his son was, still hoping for answers that never came. Kelly spent several days barely able to function, consumed by remorse and grief. Dr. Foster helped him work through these feelings, explaining that while Kelly couldn't change the past, he could still give his mother the closure she needed. Patricia King deserved to know that her son was alive. She deserved to understand why he had left. She deserved the chance to see him again if she wanted to. Kelly agreed, but he was terrified. What if his mother hated him? What if she refused to see him? What if the reunion only caused her more pain? These were all possibilities they had to accept. After much discussion, they decided that Marcus would make the initial contact. He would call Patricia King, explain that he was a social worker who believed he had found her son, and ask if she would be willing to meet with Kelly. They scheduled the call for a Friday afternoon in November of 2008, exactly 25 years after Kelly had disappeared. Marcus made the call from his office at the shelter, with Dr. Rodriguez present for support. He dialed the number they had found for Patricia Bradshaw and waited through 4 rings before a woman's voice answered. "Mrs. Bradshaw, my name is Marcus Cole. I'm a social worker here in Chicago. I'm calling because I believe I may have found your son, Kelly King." The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that Marcus thought the call might have dropped. Then he heard a sharp intake of breath. "This is some kind of cruel joke," Patricia said, her voice shaking. "People have called me before claiming to have found Kelly. Every time it's been a scam or a mistake. I can't go through this again. Marcus spoke carefully, explaining that he understood her skepticism, but that he had spent weeks verifying Kelly's identity. He described details about Kelly's life before his disappearance, details that had never been reported in the media, but that Kelly had shared with him. He mentioned the name of Kelly's childhood nanny, Ruth Morrison. He described a birthmark Kelly had on his left shoulder blade. With each detail, Marcus could hear Patricia's breathing become more rapid. Finally, she said, "If this is really my son, I need to see him. When can we meet?" The reunion between Kelly King and his mother took place on a Sunday afternoon in late November, in a private room at the shelter. Kelly had been a nervous wreck for days leading up to it. He changed his clothes 3 times that morning, trying to find something that didn't look too shabby. He wanted to present himself as having some dignity, some sense that he hadn't completely wasted his life, but his limited wardrobe made that difficult. Marcus and Dr. Foster had coached him on what to say, but Kelly knew that no amount of preparation could really ready him for this moment. When Patricia Bradshaw arrived at the shelter, accompanied by her husband Thomas, she looked much older than Kelly remembered. She was 73 now, her hair completely white, her face lined with age and worry. But her eyes were the same eyes he remembered from childhood. When she walked into the room and saw Kelly sitting there, she stopped in her tracks. She stared at him for a long moment, taking in his weathered appearance, his thinning hair, the damage that 25 years of hard living had done to him. Then, slowly, recognition spread across her face. "Kelly," she whispered. "Is it really you?" Kelly stood up, tears already streaming down his face. "Mum," he said, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Patricia crossed the room and embraced her son for the first time in 25 years. The initial reunion was emotionally overwhelming for everyone present. Patricia held Kelly for several minutes, both of them crying too hard to speak. Thomas Bradshaw stood back respectfully, clearly moved by the scene. Marcus and Dr. Foster quietly stepped out of the room to give the family privacy. When Kelly and Patricia finally pulled apart and sat down together, the conversation that followed was difficult and painful. Patricia wanted to understand why Kelly had run away. She needed to hear his explanation, needed to know what she and Richard had done wrong. Kelly did his best to explain the loneliness he had felt as a child, the pressure of expectations, the feeling of being trapped in a life that wasn't his own. He tried to make Patricia understand that it wasn't about her being a bad mother. She had loved him, he knew that. But she had been distant, always busy, and he had felt more like an obligation than a son. Patricia listened to all of this with tears running down her face. She acknowledged that she and Richard had made mistakes. They had been so focused on providing Kelly with material advantages and planning his future that they had missed what he needed in the present, their time, their attention, their interest in who he was rather than who he would become. Patricia asked Kelly why he had stayed away so long. If he had been unhappy after running away, why hadn't he come home? This was harder for Kelly to explain. He talked about the shame that had paralyzed him, how after a few months on the streets he had felt too guilty to return. He explained how the longer he stayed away, the more impossible it became to imagine going back. How could he explain to his parents that he had put them through years of agony, just because he was lonely? How could he justify causing them that much pain? The guilt had trapped him as surely as the life he had run away from. Patricia listened to all of this, and then she said something that Kelly would never forget. "I would have taken you back any day, at any time, no matter what. You were my son. Nothing you could have done would have changed that. If you had come home after a week or a month or a year or 10 years, I would have been grateful just to have you alive." Kelly realized then how much his own fear and shame had distorted his thinking. He had convinced himself that coming home was impossible, that he had gone too far to ever return. But his mother would have welcomed him back at any point. He had spent 25 years running from a punishment that existed only in his own mind. Patricia told Kelly about his father's death. She explained that Richard had never stopped looking for him, had died still hoping to find his son someday. This news devastated Kelly all over again. Patricia showed him a letter that Richard had written years earlier and asked her to give to Kelly if he was ever found. In the letter, Richard had expressed his love for his son and his deep regret about not being more present in Kelly's life. He wrote about how Kelly's disappearance had made him realize all the moments he had missed, all the times he had chosen work over his family. He apologized for not seeing how unhappy Kelly had been. He said that if Kelly ever came home, All would be forgiven. Richard just wanted his son back. Kelly read this letter with shaking hands, crying so hard he could barely see the words. This was the father he had never really known, expressing love and vulnerability in a way Kelly had never heard when they lived together. His father had changed, had grown, had learned from his mistakes. But Kelly would never get the chance to know that person. That opportunity was lost forever. The weight of this realization, that his father had died waiting for him, had died without the closure of knowing Kelly was alive, was almost unbearable. In the weeks following the reunion, Kelly and Patricia began the slow, difficult process of rebuilding a relationship. They met regularly, sometimes with Dr. Foster present to help facilitate difficult conversations, sometimes just the two of them. Patricia wanted Kelly to move in with her and Thomas. But Kelly wasn't ready for that. He was still processing everything, still trying to understand who he was and where he fit. Moving directly into his mother's home felt like it would be moving backward, trying to reclaim a life that no longer existed. Instead, Marcus helped Kelly find a transitional apartment through a program for homeless individuals working to get back on their feet. It was a small studio in a not great neighborhood, but it was Kelly's own space. Patricia helped furnish it with basic necessities, a bed, a table, some dishes and cooking supplies. She wanted to do more, to give him access to the family money that was rightfully his, but Kelly resisted. The money felt like a trap again, like it would pull him back into being Kelly King, heir to a fortune. He needed to figure out who he was on his own terms first, without the weight of wealth defining him. Patricia told Kelly about the trust fund his father had established. According to Richard's will, the money was there waiting for Kelly whenever he wanted to claim it. The amount had grown over the years. It was now worth several $1,000,000. Kelly could access it at any time, could use it to build whatever life he wanted. But Kelly asked Patricia to keep the money in trust for now. He wasn't ready to deal with that aspect of his inheritance. He had spent 25 years running from wealth, and he needed time to understand what money meant to him before taking possession of millions of dollars. Patricia respected his wishes, though she worried about him living in a tiny apartment when he could afford so much more. Thomas Bradshaw, Patricia's husband, proved to be a steadying influence during this time. He had no personal history with Kelly, no complicated emotional baggage around his disappearance. Thomas treated Kelly with simple kindness and respect, giving him space when he needed it and support when he asked for it. Thomas had grown children from his first marriage, and he applied that parenting experience to helping Kelly navigate his return to normal life. He helped Kelly get identification documents, taught him how to write a resume, practiced job interview skills with him. These practical forms of help were easier for Kelly to accept than emotional support. As Kelly worked on rebuilding his life, he also had to face the question of what to tell the public. His disappearance had been major news in 1983, and his reappearance would certainly attract media attention. The question was how much of his story to share. Patricia left this decision entirely to Kelly. It was his life, his story, his choice whether to go public or remain private. Kelly struggled with this decision. Part of him wanted to retreat completely from public view, to quietly rebuild his life without outside scrutiny. But another part of him felt that his story might help other people, other kids who felt trapped by their circumstances, other runaways who thought they could never go home, other families dealing with the trauma of a missing child. After much thought and consultation with Dr. Foster, Kelly decided to do one interview with a trusted local journalist. He would tell his story honestly, including the reasons he ran away, his years of homelessness, and his struggles with addiction. He would acknowledge the pain he caused his parents and express his regret. But he would also talk about mental health, about the pressures that can push kids to desperate choices, about the shame that can keep people trapped in destructive patterns. The interview aired on a local Chicago news station in January of 2009. The public response to Kelly's story was mixed. Many people expressed sympathy for what he had gone through and praised his courage in coming forward. Others were angry that he had put his parents through decades of suffering, just because he was lonely. Some people questioned whether his story was even true. How could someone from such wealth end up homeless unless they wanted to be there? Online comments ranged from supportive to cruel. Kelly tried not to read them, but it was hard not to see some of what people were saying. The negative reactions hurt, but they also helped Kelly understand something important. Not everyone would understand or forgive him, and that was okay. He couldn't control what other people thought. He could only control his own actions going forward. The interview did lead to some positive outcomes. Several organizations that worked with runaway youth reached out to Kelly, asking if he would be willing to speak to young people about his experiences. Kelly wasn't sure he was ready for that, but he appreciated that his story might serve a purpose beyond just his own healing. Foster suggested that Kelly might eventually find it healing to turn his pain into something constructive by helping others. But that would have to wait until Kelly was more stable in his own recovery. Finding work proved to be one of Kelly's biggest challenges in rebuilding his life. He was 35 years old with no work history, no references, and only a high school education despite having attended some of the best private schools as a child. He had dropped out before finishing 10th grade, when he was 15 and living on the streets. Most employers wanted to know what he had been doing for the past 20 years, and Kelly didn't have good answers. He couldn't exactly put homeless on a resume. Thomas helped Kelly get his GED, which at least gave him a basic educational credential. Marcus connected Kelly with employers who were willing to hire people with complicated backgrounds. Kelly worked a series of entry-level jobs, stocking shelves at a grocery store, working as a janitor at an office building, doing food prep at a catering company. The work was physically tiring and the pay was low, but Kelly found satisfaction in it. He was building a life through his own efforts, not relying on family money or privilege. He was proving to himself that he could function as a regular person, that he wasn't helpless without wealth. This was important to his sense of identity and self-worth. Kelly's recovery wasn't smooth or linear. There were setbacks along the way. About 6 months after reuniting with his mother, Kelly relapsed and used drugs for several days. The trigger was stress from trying to balance multiple jobs and anxiety about an upcoming dinner with Patricia and some of her friends who had known Kelly as a child. The prospect of facing people who remembered him as the promising heir to a fortune, people who would now see him as a failure, became overwhelming. Kelly used drugs to escape that anxiety, just as he had done for years. When he finally reached out to Marcus and admitted what had happened, Marcus helped him get back on track. Kelly spent a few days in a crisis stabilization program, then resumed his outpatient treatment. The relapse was disappointing, but it was also a learning experience. Kelly realized that he needed to be more honest with his support network about when he was struggling. He couldn't hide his stress until it became unbearable. He needed to ask for help before reaching the breaking point. Patricia was understanding when Kelly told her about the relapse. She had educated herself about addiction and understood that recovery involved setbacks. Her acceptance helped Kelly forgive himself and move forward. As time passed, Kelly began to develop a new relationship with his mother that was different from their relationship when he was a child. Patricia made real efforts to get to know the person Kelly was now, not just to remember the child he had been. She asked about his interests, his opinions, his hopes for the future. She shared more about her own life, including her struggles after Kelly disappeared, and how she had rebuilt her life with Thomas. They were learning to relate to each other as adults, which was something they had never really done. Kelly also started to learn about his father in ways he hadn't understood as a child. Patricia shared stories about Richard's life, his work, his feelings. Kelly learned that his father had struggled with his own demons, depression that he never talked about, pressure from his own father to succeed, a workaholic tendency that he used to avoid dealing with emotions. Richard King hadn't been perfect, but he had been human, complicated, doing his best with the tools he had. Understanding this helped Kelly develop compassion for his father and forgive him for not being more emotionally available. It also helped Kelly forgive himself. Both he and his father had been imperfect people making imperfect choices. Neither of them had been villains. They had just been human. 2 years after reuniting with his mother, Kelly made a decision about the trust fund. He decided to access a portion of it, not all, but enough to make a meaningful difference. He used some of the money to go back to school. At age 37, Kelly enrolled in community college, taking classes in social work. His own experiences had given him unique insights into homelessness, addiction, and the struggles of marginalized people. He wanted to use those insights to help others in the way Marcus had helped him. He also donated a significant amount of money to the Southside Hope Shelter where Marcus worked, funding programs to help homeless individuals get job training and transitional housing. Kelly stayed involved with the shelter, volunteering there regularly and sometimes speaking with residents about his own journey. He found that sharing his story one-on-one, in a context where it might genuinely help someone, was different from the media interview he had done. It felt purposeful rather than exposing. By helping others, Kelly was also healing himself. He was taking his years of pain and waste and transforming them into something meaningful. The young man who had run away at 10 because he felt his life had no real purpose was discovering purpose in unexpected places. Kelly's relationship with his mother continued to deepen and grow more comfortable over time. He started joining Patricia and Thomas for regular family dinners. He celebrated holidays with them. He even eventually moved into a better apartment in a safer neighborhood, using money from the trust fund to afford it. This felt different from accepting wealth as a child because now Kelly had agency. He was choosing to use the money as a tool to build a stable life, not allowing it to define who he was. Patricia, for her part, finally found some peace about Kelly's disappearance. She understood now why he had run away. And while it still hurt to think about the years they had lost, she was grateful to have her son back in her life. She knew that Kelly would always carry guilt about his father's death, about the pain he had caused, about the time they couldn't get back. But she also saw that he was using that guilt constructively, that he was making amends not just to her, but to the world by trying to help others. That was all she could ask for. In 2012, 4 years after Kelly's return, Patricia and Kelly went together to Richard King's grave. They stood in front of the headstone, and Kelly talked to his father. He apologized. He explained. He said all the things he wished he could have said while Richard was alive. Patricia held Kelly's hand while he cried. It wasn't closure exactly, some wounds never fully close, but it was acknowledgement. By 2015, 7 years after being found, Kelly had earned an associate degree in social work and was working full-time at a non-profit organization that provided services to homeless youth. He had maintained his sobriety, though he still attended support group meetings regularly and would for the rest of his life. He had built a small circle of friends, other people in recovery, colleagues from work, a few people from his community college classes. He was still single, having decided that he needed to be stable in himself before trying to build a romantic relationship. His relationship with his mother was the strongest it had ever been. Patricia was now 80 years old, slowing down but still sharp and engaged with life. She and Kelly talked on the phone several times a week and saw each other frequently. Kelly cherished these interactions in a way he never had as a child. He understood now how precious they were, how easily they could be lost. He had learned through the hardest possible lessons that relationships matter more than money, that emotional connection is more valuable than any material comfort, that the people who love you are the only wealth that truly counts. These were lessons he wished he could have learned without putting his parents through decades of suffering. But he had learned them nonetheless, and he was trying to live accordingly. Kelly often thought about the different versions of himself, the privileged but lonely child in Lake Forest, the desperate teenager on Chicago's streets, the addicted young man cycling through shelters, and finally the middle-aged man trying to build a meaningful life. They were all him, all part of his story, all connected in ways that were sometimes hard to understand. He had run away from privilege to find freedom, but had found only hardship. He had abandoned wealth to discover his true self, but had lost himself completely in the process. It had taken 25 years and more suffering than he ever imagined to find his way back. Not to his old life, but to a new one built on the foundation of hard-earned wisdom. Kelly knew he was lucky, luckier than the other kids he had met on the streets, many of whom were dead from overdoses or violence. Luckier than people who ended up homeless and never found their way out. Luckier, certainly, than he deserved after the choices he had made. He had been given a second chance that most people don't get. He tried to honor that second chance by living deliberately, by making conscious choices rather than running from fear or hiding from shame. It wasn't always easy. Some days the guilt still overwhelmed him. Some days he struggled with anxiety and the urge to use drugs. But he had tools now, therapy, support groups, people who cared about him, and he used them. Kelly King is now 51 years old. He still works in social services focusing on homeless youth. He volunteers regularly at the shelter where Marcus Cole found him all those years ago. His mother Patricia died in 2020 at age 85. Kelly was with her when she passed, holding her hand in a hospital room, grateful for every moment they had gotten after his return. In her final days, Patricia told Kelly that finding him again, getting to know the man he became, had been one of the greatest gifts of her life. She said she understood why he had run away, and she forgave him completely. Those words meant everything to Kelly. He still thinks about his father every day, still wishes he could have had the chance to rebuild that relationship too. But he has made his peace with the loss as much as anyone can. The money Kelly inherited, the fortune he ran away from as a child, he has used carefully and purposefully. Most of it funds programs that help vulnerable youth, support addiction recovery services, and provide resources for homeless individuals. Kelly kept enough to live comfortably but not extravagantly. He lives in a modest apartment, drives an old car, wears simple clothes. He learned long ago that material things don't determine your worth or your happiness. The question that started this story remains complicated. What happened to Kelly King? The simple answer is that he ran away from wealth and ended up homeless for 25 years before being found. But the deeper answer is more complex. Kelly King got lost, not just physically, but in every way a person can be lost. He spent decades trying to escape himself, only to discover that escape was impossible. Eventually, with help and grace he didn't deserve, he found his way back. Not to his old life, but to a new one. Not to the person he was supposed to be, but to the person he chose to become. Sometimes the journey home takes 25 years and costs you everything. But if you survive it, if you learn from it, if you use what you've learned to help others, maybe, just maybe, that journey means something after all. Or maybe it's just a tragedy with a bittersweet ending. Kelly himself isn't sure. He's still figuring it out one day at a time, trying to make what remains of his life count for something. That's all any of us can do.